Well, hello and welcome to Sunday Morning Coffee with Dr. Childress here. So today I want to discuss grief and guilt, primarily with the child and how the child is processing both of those emotions, but also the transfer of those emotions or displacement of those emotions and shame from the pathological parent to the targeted parent using the child as sort of the medium for emotional transmission. But to start with, talking about the issues of grief and guilt for the child, these are um, strongly central features of the child's experience. And so let's start with grief. The attachment system is a motivational system, and all motivational systems always have a direction to them. Regulatory systems can go up and down, like behavioral regulation or emotional regulation, they can go up or down to around a set point, a medium point. Whereas a motivational system doesn't go bidirectional, it always has a direction to it. So we are motivated to approach food when we're hungry. We're motivated to seek pleasure. We're motivated to avoid pain. And that's the function of the motivational system, is to guide us in towards direction. And the attachment system is a primary motivational system of the brain. And it's similar to the motivating systems for eating and sex. And so it is a strongly fundamental motivational system within the brain. And it always motivates the child to bond to the parent. It's called a goal corrected motivational system. If there's a barrier, if the parent's a problematic parent, the attachment system changes how it tries to bond to that parent, but it's always trying to bond to the parent. And the reason is because it evolved from predators. And if the child is motivated to sever the parent child bond for whatever reason, that child is eaten by predators or dies of starvation. So that's the origins of this motivational system. It's a one direction motivational system to bond to the parent. And when there's a breach in the attachment bond, that produces grief. And we can understand the level of grief when a child when the child loses a parent and the parent dies, and the grief that the child feels. Even as an adult, the grief we feel over the loss of a parent is the attachment grief. When a parent has a child that dies, that's tremendous grief in the parent, because that's the way the attachment system works. When there's a breach in the attachment bond, there's grief. And so, as soon as the divorce takes place, as soon as there's a separation within the family, there's going to be a grief response. There's the loss of the intact family. And that's normal. And there's going to be a sadness about the transitions and the loss. And in typical normal range families, the parents help the child navigate that and say, well, the situation is changing. We both love you. Everything's not you. It's just we can't agree. We're going to be living in separate homes and everything's going to be okay. And normal range parents give their children an understanding of what the situation is that's healthy and allows them to process their sadness and move forward. The pathological parent, though, doesn't do that. Okay, so they twist the child up to meet the pathological parent's own need. And so the child, just simply because of a divorce, the child will be feeling sad and have a grief response. What the pathological parent does is come in and twist that sadness and convince the child that the reason they're hurting, and it's an authentic hurt, it's grief at loss. But they tell or convince the child the reason they're hurting is because something that the targeted parent is doing is hurting the child. And because you're hurting, there's obvious, and it's hurting around the other parent. It's a grief response. They're not bonded, and so it must be something bad they're doing, and that's within a context of a whole lot of other um, side making. Excuse me, side making and side taking. That they create the polarization, the splitting of their pathology, and so they force the child to choose sides, and they get the child to believe that their sadness and grief and their pain is being blamed on the targeted parent. They're responsible for the breakup of the family, and there's all sorts of manipulative stuff that takes long. So what the pathology is for the child, fundamentally, all that anger and anxiety and all that other stuff is fundamentally a misattribution of the grief response of sadness. And that's because the pathological narcissistic borderline parent cannot process sadness. Sadness is processed through the attachment networks. They have damaged attachment networks. So when sadness goes through their systems or emotions, it locks them up. And so now we have the child having sadness, and they come under the influence of the narcissistic borderline dark personality parent. And that parent locks the child up in the same response to their sadness. So this is actually a pathology of pathological mourning or pathological grieving, disordered mourning. And so the child has an authentic hurt. And that's why if you try to challenge the child, they say, no, 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 I really hurt. It's really something about them that's a problem. Yeah, it's because you're not bonded to them. And so not only do we have that initial grief response of just because of the divorce, but the moment the child rejects that parent, the moment the allied parent gets that child to reject the targeted parent, the grief response skyrockets. Okay, because that's attachment bond that's motivated. And if you breach the attachment bond, you get a whole bunch of grief. So essentially, for the child, the targeted parent has died. And so you're going to have a tremendous grief response in the child, but it's all going to get twisted into this anger and into, anger loaded with revengeful wishes, as Kernberg talks about it. That's how the pathological parent handles sadness. They twist it into anger and resentment loaded with revengeful wishes, Kernberg. That's how they get the child to interpret their own or process their own sadness. So at that point, things are off the charts in terms of the child's sadness. And the child, though, can't understand why they feel so sad. And it has something to do with the targeted parent. They just know every time they're over with the targeted parent, it hurts more. And the reason is because their attachment system wants to bond to that parent, and they're not bonding, so their grief goes up. And so the parent's right there and they want to bond, but they're not bonding, so it just hurts. Whereas every time they leave that parent and go to the allied parent, it hurts less. The reason is because the targeted parent isn't there. They're not motivated to bond to that parent, and so their grief response goes down. So all the child knows is that there's a differential in their pain. But it's just simply from not bonding. And the moment we help the child and targeted parent rebond, the child goes, oh, was that it? Yeah, that's all the problem. Yeah, you're just not bonded to that parent, and everything got a little out of hand there. So at a fundamental level, the child's anger and pathology and all the attachment system is a misattribution of sadness. They're thinking it's because something is bad about the targeted parent. No, it's just a misattribution of the grief response. Now, the second emotion that's going through the child is guilt. And the guilt comes from loyalties within the family because the child loves both parents. Okay, that's just the way the attachment system works. The child is motivated, strongly motivated, to form an attachment bond to both parents. And loyalties within families are important. And so when the clan goes off to war, we want all the family members to join with. And so there's there's a important aspect to family loyalties. The problem is when the pathological parent uses that child's loyalty to them as a weapon against the targeted parent. That's where the loyalty conflicts become a problem. But just generally within families, we like that bonding. We like that sense of family loyalty, family coherence uh, in the family unity. And so when the child then rejects a parent, a beloved parent, and so don't believe the lies that the child's saying, I don't want to be. No, those are all lies. That's a beloved parent. And when the child rejects that parent, the child feels tremendously guilty. Here they're being disloyal to this beloved parent and they're siding with the other parent in the spousal conflict. That's a loyalty conflict. And so, in order to resolve that loyalty conflict, the child has to make the targeted parent deserve to be rejected. So, if the targeted parent deserves to be rejected, it's their fault and not the child. And so that's a key feature we will see with the children, and that's going to be a key barrier to overcoming the pathology once we allow it to kind of set into place. It's really, really good if we get early intervention on this, identify it really early in the court process, and get a handle on it and jump in there and stop it from developing into this more severe forms. If though we've allowed it to develop, the child cannot go backwards. The child cannot rebond with the targeted parent without admitting that there was no reason not to bond with them. And then that makes the child responsible for the disloyalty and responsible for all the bad stuff. And it's a bad child. And oh my goodness, bad thing. I mean, they just feel bad. They feel awful. And the child will never blame the allied parent. They won't say, oh, I was an innocent. It was no, the child's going to take responsibility for everything and keep the abusive parent blame free. It wasn't their fault. The child should have been stronger. The child should have, whatever happens. So going forward, in terms of treatment, it's very important not to resolve the past issues. So the child's going to want to continue to go to the past because this is a trauma pathology. It always focuses on an unsolvable past. The unsolvable past is actually in the allied parent's childhood, and we can never solve that. And so it's just a false issue returning to the past for the child. And that's the origins of the unforgivable event, because the child must make forever that parent deserve to be rejected. Otherwise, the child could never do what they need to do relative to the allied parent. The allied parent, by the way, is asking the child to essentially kill their other parent. Emotionally, psychologically, I want you to kill your other parent and join with me on my side. That is brutal and savage parenting. And it's all to use a child as a spousal abuse weapon. See, aren't you sorry you divorced me? Now you used to have a child. Now you don't have a child anymore. And so it's transfer. I'm not the rejected one. You're the rejected one. And so it's just severely pathological parenting that's killing the child of the other parent in retaliation for the divorce, which is horrendous spousal abuse, and getting the child to be the murderer of the parent, which is horrific psychological abuse for the child. So there's just all sorts of damage they're creating in this child that we now have to kind of protect the child and recover and the healthy development of the child, which is bonding to both parents. Attachment system is balanced to both parents, balanced to mom and balanced to dad. And so for the child, we never want to put the child in a position where we have to resolve things, because that's too polarized. It's going to be good, bad. Always try to move things into gray. So the child's going to separate out and say, no, it's always this way, or it's always this way, or the polarization in thinking, the splitting from the path. We want to move it into zones of gray. So what we do on the surrounding the past issues, when the child brings those up, we say, well, things got a little out of hand, but what are we going to do about it now? So we kind of take it, we acknowledge that bad things kind of happen, things got out of hand, but we don't try to put out or describe why, because that's going to be either blaming the allied parent, blaming you, or blaming the child. And we want to get away from blaming. We just want to get into fixing. So that's called solution-focused therapy. And so I highly recommend that we bring in the principles of solution-focused therapy with our overall treatment model, because that's going to allow us to separate from the unsolvable past. So we can never solve the past, but we can move into a future that is solvable. That is, we can repair from this point on. And the moment we get that bond back, the grief response goes down and everything resolves itself. So, so for the guilt, solution focused, and that's where also for targeted parents, trying to approach the resolution through the child's thinking systems is not a good idea, because then you're trying to convince the child that it's the allied parent who's creating the thing, you're being brainwashed, and the child's going, no, I authentically feel this hurt, and you're not interpreting the hurt as grief, you're interpreting it as manipulation, and so you're not helping the child understand or process or sadness, and instead you're trying to just get the child to be change sides, and the child's in the middle, and it's just not a good situation. So don't try to convince the child about what's going on in the situation. Instead, work with emotional guidance, and I'll talk about that in other places. But we want to you're the leadership in the family, so you want to be confident and secure in your leadership, and don't worry about it, and just take the steps you need to protect the child. And that's where you need support, and there's all sorts of problems around you regarding that. But this is important to understand. We cannot ask the child to reveal their authenticity until we can first protect the child from retaliation by the pathological parent. And so if the child bonds to the targeted parent, that child's going to face a psychological retaliation for that loyalty violation to that parent. They're going to manipulate the child into feeling suffering because they're not loyal to that parent. And so until we can protect the child from that retaliation, we can't ask the child to show their authenticity. So that's where the mental health people need to step up, and it's our job. We need to diagnose what's going on in the family. We need to accurately identify the problem. We need to accurately identify the child abuse concerns involved, producing severe pathology in the child for secondary gain to the pathological parent. And we need to provide the diagnosis necessary to the court and to the parents to be able to protect the child. But once we get there, we can start dealing with the grief response. We move the guilt aside to reestablish bonding, and then resolve and move the family into a normal range post-divorce family. Now, let me close by just talking about I've talked about the emotions within the child, and sort of with the targeted parent and the conflict there. At a more sophisticated psychological level, what's happening is a transfer, displacement it's called, of the emotional lockup of the allied pathological parent, the narcissistic borderline dark parent. They're locked up, and they're transferring or displacing their emotional state over to the targeted parent, and they're inserting it into them. And the primary emotion that's getting inserted over is shame. Okay, so the narcissistic borderline dark personality at a fundamental level understands their damage, understands their injury. They're afraid it's going to be revealed, and they're going to be rejected as a result because of their fundamental damage. And so the Narcissist responds very flamboyantly to signals of rejection because that's an indication of their inadequacy. Well, guess what? The divorce, you indicated they are an inadequate spouse, so now it's going to activate them into their defensive processes. The borderline responds to abandonment. And again, that exposes their inadequacy as a person. You're abandoning them, and that'll activate them into their variant of their stuff, their pathology. And so at a fundamental level, both of those personalities, dark as well, it's a variant of those personalities will collapse into their shame at being exposed for their inadequacy. So they'll want to displace those emotions over onto the targeted parent to get them out of them as a coping strategy. So I'm not the rejected one. You are. See, your child is even rejecting you. I'm the beloved one. I'm the perfect one. I'm the perfect parent. You're the inadequate parent. It's not parent, it's spouse. I'm the perfect spouse. You're the inadequate spouse. And they're using the child to kind of validate that worldview within themselves. But also at a deeper level, it's the shame. Your own child doesn't even love you. It's shame about who you are as a person. And that's their shame, the pathological parent's shame being displaced into the light or into the targeted parent. And so one of the features about this pathology, and shame is central to sex abuse. So this is a rippling sex abuse pathology. There's not sex abuse currently. It's a ripple from previous sex abuse that's affecting things. And we have the same themes present. It's just not coherent. When the sex abuse happened, the themes were all coherent. But now in the rippling, they've kind of spread themselves out a little bit. And so shame is central to that sex abuse issue. It's downloaded into the child, and the child has to process this and doesn't often do that. Doesn't disclose, doesn't get treatment, doesn't get processed. So we have shame coming through families. And at this point, the shame of the pathological parent for being inadequate is being displaced over to the targeted parent as a way of coping with it. And the child is the vehicle for passing that emotions. So the shame, the rejection, the guilt or grief, the locked up processing of grief, all of that is being transferred over here. Now it's the targeted parent who is grieving tremendously the loss of their child. That's being passed over there through the child's pathology that's being created in this way. So it's child psychological abuse, clearly, from a psychological perspective. But unfortunately, the mental health people are ignorant like a rock, and forensic psychology needs to be gone. It's disabling the mental health system response. So once we get the mental health people over into the family courts, we can start protecting the children and start protecting their parents from spousal abuse and things. But until we get there, things are deeply, deeply unfortunate. So with that, I'm going to head off to my Sunday here, and we'll check in with you next week on Sunday Coffee as to some other aspect of this pathology. So with that, everybody, good luck. Take care. Good luck.